My dear friend, by the time we reach 60, most of us don't dream much about love anymore. We stop expecting those serendipitous encounters, those sleepless nights filled with butterflies, or handwritten letters that never get a reply. But sometimes, in the quiet of a late afternoon, when we're sitting alone with no particular thought, something in us still stirs very gently, like the breeze brushing past the porch, and we wonder, do I still have a chance to meet someone? Not to start over like we did in our youth, but to find someone to walk with us through this final stretch when our steps are slower. Our sleep is lighter, and the house feels just a bit too quiet every evening. My friend Walter had a moment like that. He's a kind old man who lives alone in a modest home just outside Knoxville, Tennessee. His wife passed away years ago. His children have moved on, started lives of their own. His days pass by slowly reading the morning paper, tending the garden in the afternoon, and spending his evenings listening to old records. Not unhappy, but not quite fulfilled either. And then, one day, he decided to go on a blind date. The first one in many, many years. No one pushed him. There wasn't a special occasion. He just looked at himself in the mirror that morning, shaved neatly, put on the plaid shirt his late wife used to like, and carefully brought along a small bouquet of flowers. Not to impress, just a simple gesture of kindness, the kind of man he's always been. But that date, which he hoped would bring a little warmth back into his life, ended with him quietly standing up and walking away, all because of 4 unexpected requests from the woman he met. If you're still here with me, I invite you to walk through Walter's story, not to judge anyone, but to gently reflect on what truly brings us peace in this season of life, where love may be quieter, but no less real. The date started with small talk, nothing unusual. Walter told me everything felt gentle at first. They chatted about past jobs he'd spent years doing maintenance work at a local community college. He spoke of his only daughter, who had moved to Colorado, and those peaceful afternoons behind his house, where he tended to a small garden full of tomatoes and green onions. The woman, around 50, from Chattanooga, seemed like someone who knew how to listen. The way she nodded, the soft tone in her replies, it made Walter feel like he didn't have to try too hard. At this age, he said, it's not wit or charm that stirs the heart anymore. It's quiet kindness. Walter said that, during those first minutes, he felt at ease. No sense of being judged. No need to pretend to be someone he no longer was. But then, one sentence changed everything. Her tone grew serious. She said, if he was truly serious about the relationship, he would need to agree to a 12-month trial period living together. And as a sign of his financial commitment, he should transfer $50,000 into a joint account. Not for spending, she said, just to show that he was responsible, stable, and sincere. When Walter told me this part, he wasn't angry. He didn't joke. He didn't complain. He simply said, slowly, almost like he was reminding himself, if someone needs to see love in a number, then maybe I'm not the person they're looking for. I sat there in silence for a long while after that, because it wasn't just a rejection of a request, it was a reflection of a way of living, a quiet decision to hold on to decency, even when facing something that, on the surface, seemed reasonable. At our age, we don't need more spectacle. What we long for is a feeling of closeness, one that doesn't need to be measured, one that doesn't ask us to prove our worth with what's in our wallet. I understand for many people, a demand like that might come from fear, from the pain of past losses, and after all these years, everyone has the right to be cautious, to build a little fence around their heart. But if the first fence is money, what will the next one be? Walter didn't blame the woman. He just knew, in his own way of living, that love shouldn't begin with a transaction. He'd spent his whole life working hard, saving, taking care of his family, and now, the thing he valued most was the freedom to be himself, to live without having to guard, negotiate, or explain everything. A relationship, if it's worth keeping, should begin with trust, not with a test. and certainly not with terms and conditions. If you're watching this and you've ever been in a similar position where you had to prove your worth with a dollar amount, I just want to remind you, you are not alone, and you should never have to pay a price for a love that's truly meant for you. Feel free to leave a comment if this part of Walter's story has touched something in you, because somewhere, someone might be sitting quietly just like Walter did that day, hoping to be understood without having to explain. And then, Walter went on to tell me about her second request. It sounded lovely on the surface, but it only made him feel even more out of place. After the gentle flow of small talk, Walter told me she began to share a dream of hers. Not something wild or out of reach, just a vacation, but the way she described it made him feel uneasy. She said she wanted to take a long trip to Savannah, Georgia, where ancient oak trees hang heavy with moss. Cobblestone streets wind through quiet neighborhoods, and the homes still carry the scent of time. It's a place many call a retreat for the soul. She called it a beginning vacation, a delayed honeymoon, of sorts. There had to be romantic couple portraits, candlelit dinners, carefully curated moments to mark the start of their relationship. And she made it clear every cost from travel and lodging to the professional photo shoots would be covered by Walter. I looked over at him as he told me this and quietly asked, "How did that feel?" Walter simply smiled, then shook his head. "I don't fault anyone for dreaming," he said, "but I know that dream isn't mine." That simple answer said more than a whole explanation. At our age, not all of us feel the same excitement over perfectly painted moments. We've seen enough holidays, enough celebrations, even enough relationships where the best parts only existed in photos and disappeared the moment the camera turned off. Walter didn't need beautifully retouched portraits. He didn't want a vacation choreographed like a movie scene. What he longed for was someone truly present in the quiet parts of life, someone who could sit beside him, lift a cup of tea, and listen to stories that wandered with no clear beginning or end, and still feel warmed by them. Because the older we get, the more we realize we're not searching for things to show off. We're seeking moments where we truly feel seen, moments of stillness, where two souls connect through a glance, through silence, through a hand reaching out, unannounced. Walter didn't dismiss her dream. He understood that everyone has their own way of reclaiming joy. But when a relationship hasn't even begun, and already it needs to be proven through something dazzling to him, that was already a sign of distance, because he wasn't looking for a vacation. He was looking for someone to come home to, someone to return to in the calm of a familiar porch, on a quiet evening, with no need for a beautiful view, just someone who didn't rush. I think many of us have been in Walter's place, sitting across from someone who seemed to be painting a life we no longer wish to step into. Not because we weren't enough, but because we didn't need it anymore. If you've ever found yourself lost in someone else's lovely dream and realized it wasn't meant for you, then perhaps you understand the silence Walter held that day. If you've ever felt that way, I invite you to share a thought below, because someone listening now may need to hear they're not alone in choosing something simple over something grand. After that story, Walter seemed even clearer about what truly mattered to him at this age. And then he went on to tell me about the third request, where trust wasn't questioned with words, but with control over the very things that should be shared freely. Walter told me the third request was the one that left him sitting in silence longer than any of the others. Not because it shocked him, but because he realized if he kept trying to make things work, he might slowly become someone he no longer recognized. She said that if they ever got married, Walter's entire retirement income would be managed by her. Each month, he'd receive a fixed allowance, not too little, but not flexible either. And if he ever went over that amount, he'd have to make up for it by cleaning the house or doing extra chores. Walter sat still while she said it. No reaction, no questions. Just the quiet stillness of someone who's lived long enough to know some things aren't worth arguing over. I looked at him, and he just let out a slow breath. After more than 40 years of working, he said, "All I want in this chapter of life is freedom. I don't need someone to hold my wallet. I need someone who'll help me make decisions gently, together, with respect." His words caught something in my chest. Because maybe what Walter said is exactly what many of us have quietly carried inside, but never put into words. When we were younger, we lived through all kinds of obligations raising kids, paying off the house, holding up responsibilities we never even asked for. But at some point, what we need the most is not someone to rearrange our life for us, but someone to walk beside us with trust, not control. Walter wasn't angry, but deep down, he recognized that behind her suggestion stood a wall, an invisible line drawn between two people, as if trust could only exist if it was closely monitored. And when love starts with someone holding the purse strings, it's easy to lose the very thing that holds a relationship together: mutual respect. At this age, I believe the most precious thing isn't money. It's the right to make small decisions without needing anyone's permission. To buy an old book, to surprise your grandchild with a toy, to invite a neighbor over for a simple lunch. Small things, but the very heart of still feeling like ourselves. Walter knew not everyone comes with bad intentions. Maybe she had been hurt before. Maybe she had depended on the wrong person. Maybe she was just worried about the future. But he also knew if a relationship needed that many rules from the start, then maybe it wasn't the kind of place he could belong to. Some people believe love should be tied with firm commitments, but I think, at this stage of life, loving someone means giving them space to breathe without having to ask, without being watched. Just the quiet trust that neither of us would take advantage of the other. If you watching this now have ever felt boxed in by a relationship, if you've ever hesitated over simple choices because of fear or judgment, then I want to say this to you. You have every right to live freely. You have every right to keep your autonomy, not because you're being stubborn, but because you've lived long enough to know what brings you peace. If you've ever stood before a request that quietly weighed down your heart, feel free to share it in the comments so that others like Walter can see they're not alone in how they choose. And Walter's story didn't end there. After that third request, he had already made his decision, but he still listened. He still gave her the space to say one last thing. After the first 3 requests, Walter thought he'd heard enough to understand the kind of person she was. But then came one more thing, and it left him truly quiet. She said that whether they moved in together or even got married, they would still sleep in separate bedrooms. Not because of conflict, but simply because she had lived alone for far too long. She liked absolute silence when she slept. She didn't want to hear someone shifting in bed, or sighing, or getting up in the middle of the night to make tea, and this, she said, was non-negotiable. Walter didn't argue. He understood. At our age, everyone has their own habits, their own routines that bring a sense of calm. Some can't sleep with the lights on. Some need complete quiet just to drift off. And some, like her, have grown so accustomed to solitude that sharing their most intimate space feels like a threat. But what made Walter's heart grow heavy wasn't the idea of sleeping in separate rooms. It was the way she drew the boundary so firmly, so early on, as if there would be no space left for discovery. No room for compromise. No invitation to grow together. Walter told me this part with a calm voice. Not sad, just sure. I'm not looking for someone to split the rent with, he said. I'm looking for someone to share a life with. That sentence, simple as it was, felt like one of the deepest truths I'd ever heard. Because really, we don't need someone to split the utility bills. We need someone to share the silence. Someone willing to sit beside us even when there's nothing to say. Someone close enough that even if we're not sharing a bed, we don't feel alone in the dark. I understand that many people at this stage in life choose to keep their space as a way to protect themselves. Because we've been hurt before, we've lost sleep over petty arguments, we've lost parts of ourselves in relationships where boundaries weren't respected. But love, if it's meant to last, also needs a little willingness from both sides. Willingness to shift the space a bit, willingness to change a habit or two, willingness to open the door just halfway so someone else can step inside. Walter wasn't asking for someone to stay by his side through every hour of the night. He just hoped for a relationship that didn't begin with so many walls. Because he knew if all the lines are drawn too early, there will be no place left for two people to truly meet. If you're still listening, and you've ever met someone who made you feel like a temporary traveler instead of a true companion, then maybe you understand why Walter stood up and quietly walked away. Not because he didn't try, but because he knew when love doesn't begin with willingness. No matter how hard you try, you'll always walk beside, but never truly together. If you've ever felt like the only one leaning in while the other kept stepping back, feel free to leave a note below. Someone out there might need to hear that choosing to step away wasn't a mistake. In the end, Walter kept his calm. He didn't blame anyone. He simply knew some things, when forced, will only leave both people tired. And so, he left that little cafe, no anger, no regret, only the quiet knowing that he was still on his way to finding someone who didn't just want to live nearby, but truly wanted to live with him. Walter left that little cafe in silence, not out of anger, not because he was hurt. He simply understood that sometimes, to keep your heart at peace, you have to be brave enough to walk away, even if what lies ahead is a stretch of quiet, empty days. There are things in life that, if we force ourselves to accept, we'll end up wearing ourselves down long before anything meaningful takes root. At this age, there is no more room for relationships that must be endured just to be kept. What we need now is calm, a sense of being truly ourselves, the dignity of being respected, and the warmth of living slowly beside someone who genuinely wants to share the journey. Walter wasn't looking for someone to dazzle him. He was looking for someone with whom he didn't have to try so hard just to feel understood. And if you watching this video have ever felt out of place in the world of dating after 60, if you've ever asked yourself whether anyone still wants something honest, something real, then let me remind you of this. You have every right to say no. You have every right to keep your own quiet space. And you are fully allowed to wait for someone who doesn't ask you to give up any part of who you are just to make it work. If you're still here with me, reading these final lines, I invite you to leave a comment below just so Walter and I know that we are not alone in the way we choose to live and love, even in the later chapters of life.